I see walking the Camino de Santiago as one of the greatest experiences of my life, certainly in the top 5. I discovered reservoirs of mental and physical perseverance I didn't know I had. I met an amazing international mix of people whose backgrounds were so completely different from mine. And, how do I say this? I learned a more positive way of interacting with my traveling companion, AKA my wife. I also developed an appreciation for Spanish culture. One of the ways I did that was through the local stories I gathered along the way. I'm talking about the myths attached to one town or another. Now, though fiction, they represent the lessons people from the past felt we should learn. With that insight, it made the trip along the Camino that much more special. Each city, town, or village went from being an anonymous spot on the road to having a distinct personality. So, with that explanation out of the way, here are some of the tales of the Camino. How the Camino de Santiago got started is truly an amazing story. It's the tale of a man named James coming to Spain 2 times. Now, let's be honest, nothing points to this being anything but a myth with no basis in fact. But I don't think that matters a whole lot. It's more about how his story motivated people more than 1,000 years ago to create the Camino pilgrimage, known as the Way of St. James. James was one of the 12 disciples following Jesus. Some accounts even say he was Jesus' cousin. The Bible, in fact, says little about him. The Gospel of Mark uniquely credits him with having annoyed Jesus when James asked if he could sit at Jesus' side in heaven. Other than that, he was a pretty minor character. However, as the story goes, after Jesus was executed by the Romans for sedition, James followed the advice of angels and packed off for what was known then as Hispania and part of the Roman Empire. Now we have to remember at this point in history, Jesus' followers were intent on spreading their conviction that Jesus was the prophesied Jewish Messiah, about to usher in a kingdom of God and destroy all their enemies. This message failed to impress their fellow Jews, who figured if Jesus was dead, he was hardly the Messiah. James running off to Spain, I would contend, is the first hole in the story. That's because, from what I can gather, there were few, if any, Jews actually living in Spain at the time. The second problem with the myth version is it has James targeting pagans for conversion, but that wasn't a strategy until years later when Paul, who greatly contributed to Christianity's growth, advocated for reaching out to non-Jews. At any rate, we have James in Spain, and that didn't go so well. His message only resonated with less than a dozen people. But then we get to the supernatural part of the story. Angels summoned him to return to Judea, which he did. And there he was beheaded in the year 44 by King Herod Agrippa. The angels took his body in a rudderless boat, some stories have it as a stone boat, back to Hispania, where the boat landed at Finisterre, the end of the world. And so the story goes that James's disciples smuggled his bones to a cave in northwest Spain, where they stayed undisturbed until the year 814. seems a hermit named Pelayo claimed to have seen stars pointing to a location near the river Sar. And as he got closer, he heard angels sing. And this kind of scared him a bit, so he went to his local bishop to consult him. Now, the bishop's name was Theodomir, who dispatched a crew to the location where they found the cave, the bones, and conveniently enough, papers asserting these were James's remains. Now that was good enough for the bishop and the current pope to certify the bones as the real deal. They were carted off to Santiago, where a cathedral was built just to house them. Now keep in mind, James became a saint for having been the first of Jesus' apostles to be martyred. Now, some 900 years later, the Catholic Church seized on that and declared that anyone who committed themselves to a pilgrimage to Santiago to essentially visit St. James's bones would be absolved of their sins and therefore trim a significant amount of time off purgatory. Now, they dangled that incentive for two reasons. First, the church was fighting the Moors, that is the Muslims, for the occupation of northern Spain, and they figured that if thousands of pilgrims came into the area, that would help their cause. Plus, they realized later that with eventually millions of pilgrims coming down what was then known as the Way of St. James, they would be spending a lot of money, and some of that would trickle down into the local churches. Finally, do people now believe the bones in Santiago actually belong to James? Well, even the church has backed off on that claim. Now, it doesn't get a lot of press, but in 1897, the church authorized an excavation for the bones. After a bit of searching, they found them. And when they pieced them together, they found they had three people, not one. Now, I'm absolutely certain none of those bones actually belong to James, because I'm absolutely certain James never came to Spain. But so what if it's a myth? We don't need to prove a fiction is real. As far as I'm concerned, walking the Camino is strictly between me and my feet, me and my head, me and my heart. And I forgot about the myth other than the fact it brought me to the experiences I had. Isn't that enough? It seems King Garcia III, that's this guy right up there, was out hunting partridge when his falcon decided to veer off into a cave where Garcia found a statue with fresh lilies and a lit oil lamp. He took this as divine backing of the Reconquista, or the campaign to rid Spain of the Moors, and he took some of the money that he got from plundering said Moors and built this church in the 11th century. It's called the Monasterio de Santa Maria la Real, and Garcia, along with other royalty, are buried here. Now, I suppose you could call this story part myth, part truth. After all, there is a statue. We just don't know how it really got here. We have here what I consider to be the best myth on the Camino. It's a little gross. It involves an angel, betrayal, and cooked chickens coming alive on someone's dinner plate. How cool is that? According to the story, a German family traveling the Camino spent the night at a farmer's house here in Santo Domingo. Apparently, there was a rather saucy daughter who tried to corrupt the almost saintly German son named Huguenot. He spurned her carnal temptations. In return, she slipped a silver cup in his backpack and accused him of stealing it. He was hanged as a thief according to the laws of King Alfonso X of Castile. Ah, Here's where the story takes a supernatural turn, as all such legends must. The German family, minus one, completed their journey to Santiago, and on the return trip discovered their son was still hanging at the end of the rope. But he was still alive. Seems a rather sympathetic and tenacious saint named Dominic was holding him up all this time, keeping the pious kid alive. The family went straight away to the local magistrate, insisting that the miracle meant their son was innocent. The magistrate, who obviously wasn't that observant, and if he hadn't noticed a breathing, not quite dangling young man, laughed at them and said, "If that boy is alive, then this rooster and chicken I'm eating are also alive." And with that, his gluttonous meal decided to prove him wrong and got up and started crowing and singing. And that is the end of the story. However, we're left wondering whether the son was ever relieved of his interrupted execution. Plus, I suppose the intention of the tale is to reinforce the idea that if you're devout and faithful enough, you can get out of just about anything. And if you look at it through the lens of the 21st century, this has a misogynistic moral that women are evil and dangerous people, and men should not trust them. Lastly, as if to prove this myth is founded in fact, you can go to the local cathedral and for a charge of €5, meet some rather pampered chickens said to be descendants of the resurrected fowl. When we leave Santo Domingo, the Camino comes to the Rio Oja with this bridge originally built by Santo Domingo, aka Saint Dominic. Now, just before you cross the bridge, look to your right for the Ermita de la Puente. Now, the story goes that a hermit was killed here by a toppled ox cart. Now, that would have been the end of it, and we never would have heard about him. However, a hermit and soon-to-be priest named Dominic della Casado happened by and brought him back to life. Now, Dominic, who was born in 1013, just down the road from here, was also the same guy in the chicken story I told in the previous video. Now, he was given saint status for the chicken miracle, along with a French knight being healed of devil possession after visiting Dominic's sepulchre, and then 2 other healings. We don't know what happened to the pilgrim. Santo Domingo comes back into the picture, if peripherally. A disciple of his, Juan Velasquez, who is buried in this church, is credited with developing the road through the mountains from Villafranca to Burgos. He's also the patron saint of innkeepers and fertility. Now, that odd combination came about after Queen Isabella la Católica prayed at his tomb when she was unable to conceive and bore 2 children, Juan and Juana. Now, I wouldn't recommend opening up his tomb here, but the story goes that that's exactly what someone did, and a swarm of white bees came out, said to be the souls of unborn children the saint was protecting until they found a womb. At this fountain, known as Fuente de Gallo, there is a rooster up there. Now, as the story goes, during Mass, when everyone was in church, Napoleon's soldiers swept up all the chickens, killed them, and hid them in their drums. And just as they were sneaking off, church let out, and the townspeople discovered their chicken coops were empty. They ran after the troops, who claimed, "No, we have no chickens." But just then, a rooster came alive and crowed, which must have sounded amazing coming from inside a drum. Now, As near as I can tell, that's where the story ends, and we don't know if the soldiers actually gave back the dead chickens. But really the main point is about resurrection, which is the case with most of these myths. At any rate, at the end of July, the village celebrates the Rooster Festival, which presumably commemorates that one tough fowl, as well as the Spanish War of Independence. Fun fact here, this monastery was named after Saint Zoilus, who as a young man was killed in the year 304 in Cordoba by the Emperor Diocletian, who was trying to stamp down Christianity in favor of the old Roman gods. Now, 19 others were also executed during what was known as the Great Persecution, which lasted 8 years. And it's not clear to me why Zoilus was raised to the level of martyr and saint. However, there is a story, no doubt apocryphal, that has Zoilus rescuing the dead body of a beheaded saint who had washed ashore. Now, the requisite miracle here is that the head was somehow reattached. In any event, Zoilus's relics are housed here in a hotel. You know, it's hard to imagine now, but around here during the 8th century, a pivotal battle was fought between Charlemagne and the Moor king Aigolando during the campaign to end the Moors' occupation. Now, while Charlemagne's troops were preparing for battle, they sharpened their wooden spears, and before they went to bed, they plunked their spears into the ground. When they woke up the next morning, their spears had turned into trees. These trees. Now, without too much straining, we can add this to the list of myths that include resurrection, a miracle. So, as the story goes, the troops cut down the spears, went into battle, where 40,000 Christians were killed. But that was sort of okay, because they believed that by fighting as Christian warriors, they would go to paradise where they would mingle with priests and monks.
When we come to Vera del Camino, we find an exception to what seems to be the rule around here, that all churches are ancient. This Basilica de la Vera del Camino was built in 1961 and looks pretty modern.
Its location is based on a 500-year-old myth about a hermit who said he saw the Virgin Mary. The hermit saw this as a sign that his local bishop should build a hermitage here. The skeptical bishop needed more proof. So the Virgin Mary told the hermit to throw a rock in the air with a slingshot. And where the stone landed, she said, is where you build your church. The stone hit the ground and turned into a boulder. End of discussion. Now, at this bridge over the Rio Orbigo, we have the site of a story that's slightly fishy, but supposedly there are artifacts to back it up, at least some of it. Now, there was a 15th century knight named Don Suero de Quiñones who was spurned by the love of his life, and he took it pretty hard. And to show just how ruined he felt, he locked an iron collar around his neck and declared that he was not going to take it off until he had defeated 300 knights in a jousting contest at this bridge. Now, I'm not certain why the other knights bothered to come, but they heard the call and they took the challenge. And Quiñones defeated 300 of them, was relieved of his collar, and presumably healed of his unrequited love. Finally, he went on a pilgrimage to Santiago where he deposited a jewel-encrusted bracelet. No idea if he ever found another love.
According to other versions of the story, this bit of medieval soap opera is only half true. Don Suero might not have actually done any of the fighting, leaving it to 10 of his closest friends. And apparently the jousting was cut short after only 200 victories. It's also possible that after all this, the knight married his sweetheart, Doña Leonor de Tova. And lastly, Don Suero was murdered 22 years later after a dispute with another knight.
You know, I've lost count of all the miracle stories along the Camino that have been attributed to the Virgin Mary, but yeah, here goes another one because they never get old. This is the Iglesia de Santa Maria de la Encino, or Our Lady of the Oak. The inside is an image of Mary that was once in the cathedral at Astorga. However, invading Muslims, and they were all over the place during the 9th century, would have destroyed it if they had gotten their hands on it. So it was hidden away for safekeeping. And then it showed up on an oak tree. A miracle. Now here's a wonderful but pointless tale related to Castro Mayor. Back when the Moors occupied the area, a long, long time ago, there was a girl who tended a pig herd. And one day she left out a basket of pig snouts as a sacrifice. The next day she came back to the basket and found it filled with coal. So she took one of the lumps home with her, and it turned into gold. So she went back to the basket for more, and it was empty. And that's it. End of story. I don't know. Maybe the moral is don't get greedy? Now, if this were anywhere else, I would say this myth is worthy of a Greek tragedy. So as the story goes, when the village's namesake, Saint Julian, was born, witches laid a curse on the baby that he would kill his parents. Now, to be sure, no one knows where Julian was born, and so let's just stipulate it wasn't here, and it was a real long time ago. So, to continue. His father overheard the witch's evil doings and wanted to get rid of the baby, but his mother wanted to raise him. So, as the boy was growing up, his mother would suddenly break out into tears thinking about her son's homicidal future. The boy didn't learn about his curse until he was in the forest and a stag told him. Another version has his mother telling him about it. Either way, Julian decided he needed to get as far away from his parents as he could, and after 50 days of walking, he found himself in Santiago, where he married a wealthy widow. So let's fast forward 20 years. His parents decided that they wanted to find their son. So they found themselves in Santiago as well. And they went into a church and they met his wife. She invited them to come home with her. Julian was out hunting. And when he came home, he found two people in his bed and assumed they were his wife and her lover. Yep, he killed them. Now, if this was really a Greek tragedy, no doubt he would have killed himself out of grief. But the story's authors decided to give him a more noble decision, and he decided to go out and do devotional deeds, and one of them was to build 5 hospitals for pilgrims. From the very moment you hit the Camino, you can't avoid people telling you, Buen Camino. It's like one member of a tribe saying to another, hey, you're one of us. Or if the local townspeople say it to you, it means you're one of them, but in a nice way. Now, during the Middle Ages, the saying was ultrea, which is Latin for ultra, and somehow the pilgrims molded that into forward or farther forward. And then the person they were saying that to would say asosea, which meant upward. So in a way, the phrase ended up being farther forward and upward. It was a way of encouraging each other because, let's face it, back then, hiking the Camino was a lot more difficult. Now, it's up to you whether you say Buen Camino or Ultrea. I happen to prefer the latter because, I don't know, for some reason, it sounds more meaningful to me. And that is the end of the story.